I wanted to look again at the sugya we ended off with. I think I explained something incorrectly. So let's go over this again. Uh, and I'm going to explain why I explained it incorrectly. I thought about this afterwards. So, okay, let's start from this. So until now, the Gemara has been going through to try to find some kind of scriptural source for each of the Inuyim, besides eating and drinking. So until now, eating and drinking, we related directly to the idea of Inui. That is, until now, the Gemara said, relied on the idea that when the Torah says or any of the variants, that meant that you can't eat or drink. There was a direct relationship between the word inui and eating and drinking. Then when we went into the other ones, like Rechitza and Sicha, Milata Sandal, we were looking for hints, essentially, either hints or some kind of scriptural indication that we could relate those things, that is not eating, not washing and not anointing and not wearing shoes, to the idea of Vinui. Then we came to Tashmish Hamita. So let's look at this again from the Gemara here. So this is the very end of Ayin Vav Amud Bet and the beginning of Ayin Zayin Amud Bet. I'm sorry, at the end of Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph, the beginning of Ayin Zayin Amud Bet. Where it says Tashmish Hamita De'ikre Inui Minalat. So from where do we learn that having sexual relations is called inui? Or more, so this should be understood slightly differently. That is, and this is, I think, where I made the mistake. Where do we learn that not having sexual relations, right? Just like we said, Rechitza Minalan, what the Gemara meant there was, where do we learn that washing is an inui? Where do we learn that not washing is considered to be an inui? Where do we learn that not anointing is considered to be an inui? And so here also, Tashmish Hamita, that it's called an inui. Where do we learn that from? So we said, Dichtiv, because it's written, Im ta'aned benotai b'tikach nashim. So Rashi right away says, Im ta'aneh, or the Gemara says, Im ta'aneh mitashmish v'im tikach mitzarot. Im ta'aneh means if you stop having relations, that's the inui, right? So that inui means explicitly in this context to not have sexual relations. And then if that's, then while we're here, we want to understand the rest of the pasuk, in tikach nashim. If you take women, that is in tikach mitzarot, if you take other women, that is, if you take other women who would be fellow wives to the wives that you already have, which were his daughters and their handmaidens. Rashi also says, "Im tikach mitzarot, hishbiyo k'mashma'o, shelo yosif lahen tzarot." He made him swear, as is implied, that he should not add on sarot, he should not add on fellow wives. So once again, who said this? Im ta'aneh benotai.
Lavan says this to Yaakov.
Right. So Lavan says this to Yaakov, and we want to bring from here a proof that Inui, that the language of Inui itself means to withhold sexual relations in the context of the marriage. Okay. So while we're there, we see Intanet benotai tikach nashim. So I think when I was explaining this the first time, I said that it was I was confused because ta'aneh here, ta'aneh elsewhere, like not like onata that the Torah says regarding the obligations that a man has toward his wife. One of the things is her onah, right? He's not allowed to reduce the onah that he has with his wife, and that was understood to mean sexual relations. So in here it says in ta'aneh, it would seem to mean the opposite. If you withhold sexual relations. So we'll put this together in a minute. So, but for the moment, the way the Gemara is working is, and this would be a reasonable shot in the pasuk there. It's not a stretch at all to say that in ta'aneh means I'm making you swear not to withhold relations from my daughters, and at the same time, I'm also making you swear not to take other wives, to take fellow wives. So the Gemara challenges that. Says, "Ema idu mitzarot." I could say that both parts of the pasuk are a warning against making Yaakov swear that he's not allowed to take fellow wives. Why would I think that both parts of the pasuk would refer to the idea of not taking tzarot?
Oh, from the context.
Well, okay, so explain the pasuk using that. Why is that not?
I mean, Lavan.
What is Lavan repeating himself? If that's true, right? If both of them are about tzarot, is Lavan just repeating himself? Why would I think that both parts of the pasuk refer to tzarot?
Could you read it something to the effect of "Don't afflict my daughters by taking other women"?
Yes. In other words, so the first part of the pasuk, im taned benotai, think of it like this: im taned benotai colon, im tikach nashim. So in other words, I could understand ta'aneh here in a broader sense of inui, which just means to suffer. Im ta'aneh benotai, if you make my daughter suffer by taking other wives. That's the challenge, right? So that's how the Gemara says, why don't we read it like that? If we read it like that, then what's the problem?
Then this isn't a proof text for the for abstaining from shimush mita.
Right, right, from tashmish mita. So why don't I read it like that? In other words, that seems to be a reasonable shot. But the Gemara says, Miktiv im tikach, ve'im tikach ktiv. Does it say if you will take, and if you will take is written? So what's the Gemara's answer?
They're two separate issues.
How do you know they're two separate issues?
The Vav.
The Vav. So the Vav tells me that it's a new stitch, right? It's a new sentence actually. So the first part of the pasuk is saying Im tanet benotai, and the second part of this pasuk is saying, in addition to that, Im tikach nashim, ve'im tikach nashim. So at this point, I can go back to my original pshat. I can say that Im tanet benotai was one shvua. You're not allowed to withhold sexual relations from my daughters. Im tikach nashim is that you're not allowed to take fellow wives. Ve'ema ide v'ide mitzarot, chad letzarot didei, v'chad letzarot l'datyan le me'alma. So we push back and say, okay, so granted that these are two separate things, they're two separate parts of the pasuk, two separate shvuot, you might say. But why don't I say that both of them are talking about tzarot? Chad, hold on a second, Paul just came in. Chad the tzarot didei, v'chad the tzarot atyan le'me'alma. So say one is for his tzarot, and one is for tzarot that came from, literally from the world, like from wherever. Shalom, Paul. I see you're outside.
Shalom. Yes, I'm going to turn the video off. I'm quite far from home, so I'm just going to listen to you.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Okay.
No, that's okay.
Uh-huh.
Join right in. So what are we saying? We have this issue that the first we had the issue that the first part of the pasuk and the second part of the pasuk, we thought maybe the first part of the pasuk explains the second part of the pasuk, and then I'm dochet, right? And then I reject that. And if I reject that, then I can say the first part of the pasuk is telling me you're not allowed, that Lavan is making Yaakov swear that you have to swear not to withhold sexual relations from my daughters. And the second part of the pasuk is you're not allowed to bring in other wives. So now the Gemara says I could still say both parts of the pasuk are talking about sarot. They're both talking about sarot. What's the difference? The first part of the pasuk, im tikach, im ta'anet benotai, that's making Yaakov swear to not take to not take other wives, to not make other tzarot, we'll say, right? A little more specific. What is it? Chad tzarot didei. So that would be that he's not allowed to make tzarot from his. That is, he's not allowed to make tzarot from women that are already in his sphere, right? So who are the women that are already there that he could make tzarot?
Bilha and Zilpah.
So Bilha and Zilpah. So the idea being that at this moment, Bilha and Zilpah are not really tzarot as such. What would make them tzarot?
If Yaakov marries them.
If Yaakov formally marries them.
Formally marries them, yes.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, marries them, formally marries them. That is, what was their status at that moment?
Concubine.
What does that mean? What was their status? What does that mean actually?
It means that I'm guessing that they do not have, it implies a lesser level of obligation on the part of Yaakov. And I don't know exactly what a concubine is entitled to, but presumably it's a lesser level of.
Yeah, so actually, technically you might be right. Also, concubine, I think, might mean different things in different places, but what it means generally is what you say, that Bilhah and Zilpah were not full wives. But what we understand from the Torah, just from the pshat of the Torah, is they weren't really wives at all, right? What was their real status? They were essentially just extensions of their mistresses. Lavan gave each of his daughters an amah, and he gave each of them a maidservant, and they had the option. In other words, Rachel and Leah had the option of letting Yaakov sleep with them in order to produce children. It's an option that both of them exercised. But really, they, in a sense, they belonged to the daughters more than they belonged to Yaakov per se. They were really just extensions of the daughters themselves. So at that moment, they're not considered to be tsarot. So according to this pshat, maybe Lavan was telling him, you're not allowed to make them into full wives. In other words, you're not allowed to marry them. And that would be introducing tsarot from a known quantity, right? From a known pool of Rachel and Leah.
So it occurs to me, though, that, I mean, thinking about the precedent of Sarah and Hagar, where Hagar was Sarah's maidservant, and she gives her, as it were, to Abraham. But then afterwards, she has to tell Abraham, send her away. She can't do so herself. So it's so presumably the maidservant has gained some rights, or the woman or the wife has lost some rights vis-a-vis the maidservant.
Well, maybe I understand it a little differently. I would say the Hefe, that it was because Sarah still had command over Hagar that she could tell Abraham to send her away. In other words, sending Hagar away was not merely a matter of telling her to leave, apparently, because Abraham has to actually take her physically and accompany her out of their sphere. So I think that, and of course, in line though with what you're saying, it would seem that Sarah was concerned that Hagar was maybe acting as if she was another wife.
So, I mean, another way to think about this is that Hagar was an extension of Sarah, and it's not that she acquired certain rights vis-a-vis Sarah, but rather that Sarah's power over Hagar, or Sarah in general, did not have I mean, Sarah was entitled to certain things from Abraham, but what she did not have was the right to dispose of her property.
I'm not.
Shell.
Yes.
Yes, in modern terms, I would say that these Amot were surrogate mothers.
Yeah, that's true. But let me address both you and Michael. That the reason I wouldn't say simply surrogate mothers is because in modern parlance, a surrogate mother may have nothing at all to do with the family setting, right? In other words,
Yes,
be
yes.
somebody-
She is not married. The surrogate mother is not
Right.
married to the
She's not married to the father.
the father. Yes.
She's not
Or,
married.
and she's not a member of the household in any other way, by virtue of that relationship.
Right, or she's not necessarily in any part of the household. And typically, she's not. So, but it is a surrogacy. That's sort of what I mean by saying that the Amots were extensions of their mistresses. They weren't wives. So I'll tell you, like in Halacha, and like later on in Tanakh, we have the idea of the Pilegesh. So Pilegesh, Chazal understood to be a woman who has a formal relationship with the man, but she doesn't have the right to Ketubah, right, which is the financial security that a wife has. So without getting too much into the weeds and without dwelling too much on the case of Sarah and Hagar, I would just leave it. I would leave it more or less the way I said in the beginning, that the idea that Sarah tells Abraham to remove Hagar, I don't think that's a reflection of some kind of limitation of the power of Sarah. I think it's more a reflection of the fact that Sarah is not actually in a position, in terms of her position as a wife, to take Hagar out. That is, that's the job for the man of the house. It's something that a man has to do. Sarah is not going to wander away from the home or the camp. And the Hefech, Sarah is commanding Abraham to do this. So it was in her. It's because of her right to do this. Again, I think it's consistent with the idea that the maidservants in these regards are extensions of their mistresses. So back here to the Gemara, though, I think we get the idea, at least generally, and I'm not claiming to have more expertise than what I understand from the pshat of the psukim here. The Gemara is making this argument that, in other words, in our Gemara, we're still concerned about the idea that we want to prove that Tashmish Hamita is an Inui. And what that means is that refraining from Tashmish Hamita is an Inui. And so we want to learn it from Intanet Benotai. So now we say maybe Intanet Benotai, maybe the Inui is to make the daughters suffer by elevating the status of Bilhah and Zilpah into tsarot, making them tsarot, and that would cause consternation, right? That would cause some kind of upset or suffering on the part of his daughters. And Lavan, of course, being the one who gave them to begin with, gave them specifically not as wives to Yaakov, he gave them as amot to his daughters. So he doesn't want Yaakov to marry them. And then the second part of the pasuk, V'im tikach nashim, that would be telling Yaakov not only that, you're not allowed to take wives from elsewhere, me'alma, right, from the general population. So let's just look for a second here at Rashi. So Rashi says Hachi Garsinan, and we're not going to look at what may have been the other girsa of Rashi that Rashi is rejecting. But Rashi's girsa is the girsa as we see it in the Gemara, which is, as I said, normally the case. Because in the vast majority of cases where Rashi says Hachi Garsinan, he's rejecting a girsa that he saw in a Gemara, normally, and replacing it with what he thinks is the corrected girsa. And once he did that, I think I mentioned this before, once he did that, within a generation, all the copyists in the area, like in that part of Europe, when they were copying Gemaras, put in Rashi's girsa into the Gemara. Right? I think we've talked about this before. Rabbeinu Tam mentions this at the beginning of his Sefer, the Sefer HaYashar of Rabbeinu Tam. In his introduction, he mentions this, that once Rashi established a girsa, the other girsa was essentially wiped out. We can sometimes reconstruct what the girsa was. Tov, I think I had an idea to make this a subject of a thesis, which maybe, God willing, I'll eventually get back to. But since I'm anemic, I'm game, right? I have all these things in my head. I'll just let them spill out. And you'll pardon me if I've already told you all this. I have a feeling I have over the years, but it's like this. Rashi was a generation removed from Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom was a meaning that Rashi learned in yeshiva, in the general learning environment that was established by Rabbeinu Gershom. And Rabbeinu Gershom was concerned about a number of things, and one of them was the girsa of the Gemara. So Rabbeinu Gershom, one of his takanot / haramim was that no one is allowed to change the girsa of the Gemara. And if you think that there's a mistake, you have to write a note on the side of the Gemara. You're not allowed to change the body of the text. In fact, Rabbeinu Gershom apparently wanted to make a kind of Masorah, a kind of a concordance of some sort for Gemaras, because he wanted to fix the girsa of the Gemara. By the time of Rabbeinu Gershom, he already saw that there were variants in the text, and he understood that some of them were mistakes, copyists' mistakes, but some of them maybe weren't, and it was hard to always tell which was the proper girsa, right? The assumption being that there was a single proper girsa, which is now being lost because there are more and more either mistakes creeping in or people who are changing the text because they think there's a mistake. And they change the text, but maybe their change was the mistake. So he wanted to put a stop to all that. And it's one of the factors that leads Rashi into writing his commentary altogether. It's not certainly the only factor, but we see it's one of the things that Rashi has incorporated into his commentary, is when he thinks that there should be a girsa change. So when I was learning in yeshiva, we were taught that whenever Rashi says Hachi Garsinan, that he had in front of him more than one version of the Gemara. And Hachi Garsinan means that this is the one I choose, right? Literally, this is the way we learn. And it means we're going to choose this girsa over any other girsa. The idea that I had to write about, I did start to write about it, but I haven't done anything formal with it, is to point out that there are a number of places where Rashi supplies the girsa without any other textual source for it. In other words, Rashi fabricates the girsa when he believes that there is no proper girsa in front of him. Sometimes he just says that Rashi makes the emendation based on the way he thinks the Gemara should read, even if he didn't have an actual manuscript showing his girsa. That's the feature. Sometimes he is clearly choosing from a different girsa. That is, that he had more than one girsa in front of him, he chose one. But there are times when Rashi seems to make up the girsa. And the reason I say this is because we have testimony from other Rishonim that he did that. Tosfos says this, Ramban says this, not in every place, but in very specific places. There's a Ramban in Nida where he brings down Rashi's commentary in his Girsa, and the Ramban essentially says, the way Rashi learns makes good sense in the context of the Gemara, but the problem is this Girsa doesn't exist anywhere. It says Ein b'chol hasfarim. There's no actual text that says what Rashi says. Tosfos says similar things. So I had this idea to write a thesis by going through and analyzing each place where Rashi says Hafik Garsinan, first to determine, did Rashi choose from a known girsa or did he make up a girsa? And if he did make up a girsa, what was his conceptual basis for doing that? That is, was there some kind of a thread that ran through all of Rashi's choices to make up girsa? And on a slightly deeper level, because here's the challenge. The challenge is, what do I think is more important, or what do I think has primacy? I guess is a better way of putting it. What has primacy? Is the written text granted primacy, or do I, because of this idea, this tradition already that I have from Rabbeinu Gershon, that any given text of the Gemara is suspect. In other words, I'm not sure if any given text of the Gemara is an accurate text. Then maybe what has primacy is reasoning. Reasoning ultimately has primacy. And if reasoning has primacy, then what is that reasoning? What's the basis of that reasoning? Is it more than just trying to fit the words that I see in front of me in the context of the sugya that's in front of me, or is there something else underlying that? And this is something that Rashi did frequently and had a huge impact, as I say, because as Rabbeinu Tam testifies, because Rashi was so widely respected and accepted, he effectively, clearly without meaning to, he changed the way Gemaras were copied from his generation and on. And where we...
Or he affected it just north of the Pyrenees, or also...
Well, I don't know, and this is part of something I would have to research more. What I can tell you is it didn't affect Girsa in North Africa. So in North Africa, where we have Rabbeinu Hananel, so Rabbeinu Hananel is earlier than Rashi, but people who learn Rabbeinu Hananel, or the Rif, who was learned in yeshiva, in the line that came from Rabbeinu Hananel, and then the Rambam subsequently, in many places clearly don't have the girsa that Rashi has. This was, and Rashi was aware of Rabbeinu Hananel, it's not clear to me personally, but I don't claim high expertise. It's not clear to me if Rashi saw all of the Perushim of Rabbeinu Hananel, but he certainly saw some of them because he mentions Rabbeinu Hananel. He refers to him by name. But we know that in North Africa, that the Girsa was often not the same as Rashi's Girsa. It was often, even not Rashi's Girsa, but I'm including Rashi's Girsa in that. And the other thing I'll point out, hold on one second. The other thing I'll point out is that Girsa seem to be more sacrosanct in North Africa. That is, we don't see people saying Hafigar Sinan in North Africa. And in my recollection, which is not 100% reliable, I only know of one place explicitly where Rambam says that a Girsa should be changed. There's one place where the Rambam in his Perush on the Mishnah says that a Girsa should be different than the way it appears. But in general, Girsa was accepted as is, and you worked with what you had, regardless of whether or not it seemed to make sense. It was your job to make it make sense. So, Paul, what did you want to say?
Now, what about the modern Gemarot, or let's say that the Vilna Gemara, or are they purely Rashi's Gemarot, or
Almost.
was there a critical revision?
Well, if you want to know more about the Vilna Shas in particular, if you have an actual Vilna Shas, a full Shas, when they finished printing it, they finished printing the last volume. It was printed over a period of several years. When they finished printing the last volume, in the last volume, in the last pages of the last volume, there's a long description of how the Shas got printed. And they talk about the care that they went to not only bring together all these commentaries under one roof, but also to make sure that these were accurate renditions of every text that they had. But remember that the Vilna Shas was working with Gemaras, both printed Gemaras and manuscripts that had long, for centuries, had used Rashi's Girsa. That was because those were the most widely used manuscripts, and subsequently the most widely used printings. So when you learn a Vilna Shas, which is what everybody uses now, in other words, even though nowadays we have some shasim that might print on the side some variant girsa of, but the basic text that you see is the Vilna Shas. So the Vilna Shas became a standard, that we still use to this day, and that standard goes all the way back, to this time in Rashi's era, where people were already changing the text to fit Rashi's Girsa. So I find the whole thing fascinating. That's why I want to write more about it. But
do we have copies of the North African Girsaot?
So the way we have Girsot from North Africa are from these Perushim. So let's say Rabbeinu Hananel is a very good example. And
so not the original text, but what the commentators told about the text.
So in some cases we have the original text, or I'm not saying we have. I don't know that we have autographed manuscripts of Rabbeinu Hananel himself.
Yeah, copies.
We have copies of that. So now there's a history of the printing of Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel, I think, and I may be wrong on this, but I think most of the Perushim that get printed in the Vilna Shas are printed for the first time in the Vilna Shas. I think because I think some of those manuscripts were lost for many generations, and then they started to surface, I think, in maybe the late 18th, early 19th century. I may be wrong about that, but I think a lot of them were newly discovered. And I can tell you that in our time, there are now critical editions of the Rebbeinu Hananel on several Masechtot, and I believe that some of those are based both on earlier printings and as well as other discovered manuscripts, and also the way other Rishonim quote the Rebbeinu Hananel. About 100 years ago, there was the publication of the Otzar HaGaonim. The Otzar HaGaonim was also a kind of critical edition of Perushim and Shuvot that were written by Gaonim, and many of the sources were Eduyot, right? They were testimonies that we find from Rishonim who quote earlier Gaonim. And I believe that some of it was based on what were then newly discovered manuscripts from the Cairo Geniza. Cairo Geniza opened up a lot of sources in the Gaonim that had been lost for generations. So about 100 years ago, it's a monumental undertaking, and now I can't remember the name of the fellow who did it, and I apologize to him. You can now actually download all of the volumes of the Otzar HaGaonim, and I have the printed copy at home. But yeah, in any event, to answer your question, in a typical Beit Midrash, even if you don't have Otzar HaGaonim, but you have Rebbeinu Hananel now printed in the margins of many of them Seftot. You have the Rif, and you have the Rambam. And we see there's a phenomenon where sometimes Achronim who are trying to find sources for the Rambam get stumped, or they don't understand exactly what the source of the Rambam is, because what the Rambam says seems to contradict what the Gemara says, or it doesn't seem to be in line with what the Gemara says. And very often, the answer to that problem is that the Rambam had a different girsa that these Achronim didn't see, because the girsa that they saw was always Rashi's girsa, or nearly always Rashi's girsa. But if they'd had, let's say, Rebbeinu Hananel's girsa, then they would understand how the Rif or the Rambam understood in Paskin. So, okay. That was a long introduction to Hafi Garcina. So Rashi, though, clearly was concerned with the way the Gemara was being presented here. And the girsa that we have, as we see, is Rashi's girsa. Right? So we see in Rashi, it says Hafi Garcina, the Ema Yidi v'Yidi Mitzarot. Let's say both parts of the pasuk are talking about tzarot. It's mitzarot that Yaakov is prevented from taking other tzarot. It says miktiv im tikach v'im tikach ktiv. Does the Gemara say, or does the Torah say im tikach? It says v'im tikach, right? So we explained that. And Rashi's going to explain it also. Ve'ema yidi v'yidi mitzarot, chad tzarot didei, v'chad tzarot atyan me'alma. Dunya de v'im tikach. It's like v'im tikach, miktiv im tikach v'im ta'aneh, im ta'aneh v'im tikach ktiv. So now we say, this part we didn't read right now, but we'll just read it. Rashi, to answer the second question. The second question is, let's say both parts of the pasuk are talking about tzarot. The first one is the tzarot that were already, as it were, in the family. That would be Bilha and Zilpah, as Rashi's going to explain. And the second part of the pasuk would be to take tzarot me'alma, right, from anywhere else. The Gemara is going to answer Dumya v'im tikach. It's like the im tikach. Does it say im tikach v'im ta'aneh? Im ta'aneh v'im tikachti. Does the Torah say first im tikach nashim and afterwards say im ta'aneh benotai? It says im ta'aneh benotai v'im tikach. In other words, there's an emphasis on the order, which Rashi will explain. V'hachi perusha. So this is how we'll explain it. Ve'ema idi v'idi b'tzarot. Let's say both parts of the pasuk are talking about tzarot. V'hachi kama. This is how we'll read it. Im ta'aneh benotai. If you make my daughters suffer, likach nashim alehem, to take wives on them. There's to add additional wives. Miktiv im ta'aneh. Im tikach, dilahavi im tik. Does it say im ta'aneh im tikach in that order? I'm sorry, im ta'aneh im tikach, dilahavi im tikach perush. Does it say im ta'aneh im tikach, right, without the vav? Sorry, I'm just getting a little off kilter here. Does the Torah say im ta'aneh benotai im tikach nashim? So that im tikach would then be an explanation of im ta'aneh, as Michael Schwartz explained earlier. The im ta'aneh, the im tikach ktiv. There's a vav on these that begins the second stitch. The im tikach ktiv milta achritehi. So it's another thing. It's a separate clause. The Ema idi mitzarot. So now we're up to the part of the Gemara that we were discussing. Let's say both of them are telling Yaakov not to take other wives. Chad l'tzarot didei. So the first clause of im ta'aneh would be to take other tzarot, to take tzarot from the present family configuration. Shelo yaseh, right? Chad l'tzarot didei. Shelo yaseh bilha v'zilpa gvirot shavot lahem. To not make bilha and zilpa gvirot, right? To make them mistresses that would be equivalent to Rachel and Leah. V'hadarash be, and then the second part of the pasuk im tikach is Lavan making Yaakov swear in tikach nashim. That would be fellow wives that would come to him afterwards from elsewhere. And what's the argument for reading the pasuk this way? This makes sense because dumya devi'im tikach. It's like the im tikach. Right. In other words, I'm still going to try to push the idea that im ta'aneh, which is the beginning of the pasuk, should be like the second part of the pasuk. Now, I'll just point out as a perush to the perush of Rashi. Let's go back for a second and just see this inside. So we said, Tashmisha mitadi kre inuim enalan tichtiv im ta'aneh benotai im tikach nashim im ta'aneh mitashmish tikach mitzarot. That's how I want to learn the pasuk. So learning it that way gives me the perush of ta'aneh that means withholding of sexual relations. So the Gemara pushes back, says, why don't I say both sides of the pasuk are talking about tzarot? Now, I think I'll mention this, or I'll ask this to you as a question. Why altogether right? Why am I so interested in this idea that the second part of the pasuk, Tikach Nashim, should be seen as a perush to the first part of the pasuk? What is there in the text that would indicate that to me at all? Think of it this way. What's the difference between the understanding or the implication of the first part, Im Taneh Benotai, and the second part, Im Tikach Nashim?
Maybe because it could make it broader. It's not necessarily just sexual relationship. It could be broader, money, inheritance.
Right. In other words, exactly. Im Taneh, I can understand that as a broad azhara, right? Lavan is introducing this shvuah by saying, you have to swear not to make my daughters suffer. In tikach nashim is specific. Inui is broad. We know that it's broad, right? Because for the last several dapim in the Gemara, we understand Inui could mean rechitza, it could mean sicha, it could mean all kinds of things. So when I come to in tikach nashim, then it's a reasonable parshanut to say in tikach nashim is there to be mefaret. It's there to detail what the inui is. And that's why I believe the Gemara is pushing back. So the first time it pushes back, Ema idi mitzarot. I'll say both of them are talking about tzarot. And like we said, and like Rashi said, like Michael Schwartz said, that im tikach nashim is a perush of im ta'aneh. That's a perfectly reasonable way of understanding the pasuk because ta'aneh is such a broad category. In other words, you, Stam Gemara, you want to say im ta'aneh benotai is in fact specific, that it's really only talking about holding back Tashmi Shemitah. But you know what? There's an easier way of reading the pasuk without attributing that specific meaning. And the easier way is to read that the first part of the pasuk is broad, and the second part of the pasuk is the perush to the first part. So the Gemara says, look, you can't say it's both talking about tzarot, because there's also another grammatical aspect to the pasuk, which is ve'im tikach nashim. The vav indicates that it's a new clause. If it was a perush, it should have been im taner benotai, im tikach nashim, right? Or some variant thereof, and then it would be clear. But here, I understand it's a second clause. So the Gemara, though, I believe, is still right. It's still basing itself on its first assumption. Though I'd say the Makshan on the Gemara is still holding to the first assumption that Ta'aneh is still a very broad term. And so it says. So the Gemara pushes back and says, "Ema idi v'idi l'mitzarot, chad tzarot didei, v'chad tzarot atin me'alma, dumya de'im tikach." Similar to v'im tikach, meaning what? I did all this partly to explain how Rashi is explaining. V'hadar v'im tikach, right? V'ema idi v'idi mitzarot, chad tzarot didei, shelo yasabila v'zilpa gvirot shavot lahen. V'hadar ash be'em im tikach nashim, dainu tzarot atyam lehu levatar echad alma, v'hachem mistabra. And this makes sense. Dumya devi'im tikach. That is, it makes sense because I still want to say that im ta'aneh should be like the specificity of the second part of the pasuk, where it says im tikach nashim, dumya de im tikach. It should be like im tikach in that regard. It should be specific since it's specified already in the second part, I'll say it's just a further explanation of the first part. But here I'll make a reason to say why there are two causes for tzarot. Because there's two kinds of tzarot in this context. There's tzarot like Bilha Zilpa, who are already within the sphere, and not only that, those are maidservants that Lavan himself gave to his daughters. And what Lavan is saying is, even though I personally gave these to my daughters, by no means did I ever want you to make them into full wives. And then the other part of the pasuk will be, and not only that, you're not allowed to take wives from anywhere else. So the Gemara is saying, if I can learn the pasuk like that, then this is not a proof text for Inui being about Tashmish Mita. So the Gemara answers, Miktiv im tikach v'im ta'aneh, im ta'aneh v'im tikach ktiv. Right? So the Gemara wants to say, the fact that im tikach does not come first, but it comes second, refutes your thesis. So Rashi explains like this: Miktiv im tikach v'im ta'aneh. Does it say im tikach v'im ta'aneh? Tzarot v'im ta'aneh, tzarot de alma v'im ta'aneh. Rashi explains, tzarot de alma kashot lahen mina rishonot. He's saying there's a psychological dimension here, that tzarot that come from elsewhere, from outside the present family configuration, those are harder than the first ones. Who are the first ones?
Zilpa and Bilha.
Zilpa and Bilha. So, in what sense? What is Rashi saying, that the tzarot that come from elsewhere would be harder than Zilpa and Bilha? What does he mean? Harder for whom and harder for what?
They would be harder for Rachel and Leah.
Right. Why do you think? What's the underlying idea here? Why would that be harder?
Because Rachel and Leah gave their respective maidservants to Yaakov, and this would be at Yaakov's own initiative.
Very good. Very good. In other words, it might be hard for them to accept an elevation of Bilha and Zilpa, but on the other hand, they're already letting Yaakov have relations with them, and they will still see themselves as having some kind of a personal relationship with them. But if Yaakov introduces tzarot that none of them know, that's a real blow. And I don't think any of us has any personal relationship with this, but there is an idea, right, that the Gemara talks about this, the idea that tzarot in general, it's difficult for the tzarot, right? There's a kind of a competition between them. We see it already with Rachel and Leah, right? There's a competition even between sisters when they become tzarot, and the Gemara expands on this elsewhere in Yevamot and elsewhere. And I remember, sort of anecdotally, a number of years ago, many years ago, there was a documentary about the Black Hebrews in Dimona who practiced polygamy, and they actually interviewed a wife after she found out that her husband was taking another wife, and it's extremely upsetting. It's the established wife is going to see that on some level as a kind of a rejection of her. Again, not that I have any personal experience with this, and not that I would want any such personal experience, but so Rashi, this is Rashi's explanation of the Gemara, and I think it's a reasonable explanation that, in other words, that the idea is that having tzarot in any event is a blow to whatever, to the wives. But if I had, if the wives had to choose, like, it's going to be easier for them to accept women that they know are already sleeping with their husband than to take women who aren't in. And not only that, Bilhan Zilper is sleeping with Yaakov, and they were given voluntarily by Rachel and Leah. And if he brings in Tzarot Me'alma, then they have no say in that. And I think that would be a bigger, personal blow to them. Okay, so in the Gemara, Miktivim tikach v'imtaneh, Tzarot Alma kashot lehen min harishonot, Rashi says, uvereisha havale lashvuye atzarot da'alma. Then if you want to tell me that both parts of the pasuk are talking about tzarot, and the first part of the pasuk is talking about the tzarot hakayamot, which would be Bilha and Zilpa, and the second part of the pasuk is talking about tzarot da'alma, then Lavan should have led with the second part. He should have led with the Mur Chabur. He should have said, he should have started off by saying, you're not allowed to take women from outside of the women that you have now. And then he should have said, not only that, but you can't even take the women that you're already sleeping with your wife's permission, and elevate them. It should have been in that order. This is not how people talk, to first warn against the thing that's easy and then to introduce something that's even harder. It was when you're making such a statement, you start off with the more chamur part. You say, this is what you're not allowed to do. And not only that, even the thing that you might have thought you're allowed to do, you're not allowed to do. So that's what the Gemara says. So I see that's not what Lavan was saying. By dint of the fact that Lavan introduces the first clause first and the second clause second, I understand now they must be independent clauses. It can't be that the second clause is about Tzarot Da'alma, that's somehow an extension or somehow related to the first clause, which is talking about Tzarot. Rather, the second clause is talking about Tzarot. First clause is talking about Tashmish Amita. So now, Amarle Rav Papa Labaye. Okay, so that essentially takes care of this whole proof from Intanet Benotai. Now we have another possible source. Amarle Rav Papa Labaye. Rav Papa says to Abaye, Ha tashmish gufa ikre inui. Tashmish itself is called inui. And this is, as I told you, this was part of a mistake I made in how I learned last week. And this is why I had trouble understanding this part of the Gemara. So until now, the Gemara is proving that the inui means withholding tashmishamita. So now Rav Papa says to Abaye, wait, this whole proof falls down. The whole proof doesn't make sense. Hold on a second. the whole proof doesn't make sense because tashmish gufa ikre inui. Having sexual relations is called inui. Dichtiv vayishkav ota vayanea. So, what's Rav Papa's problem? What's his kasha? If tashmish is called inui, then what's the problem?
Then it can't be, then not low tashmish, not having relations can't be a nui as well.
Right. So Rav Papa says, look, inui means, inui means, tashmish itself is inui. And so if that's true, then im taneh benotai can't mean at all what you're saying it means. Im taneh benotai would mean if you have sexual relations with my daughter, it would be Lavan telling Yaakov he's not allowed to have sex with his daughters. And not only is that then not a proof that im taneh benotai doesn't, is not a source for us to learn that you're not allowed to have tashmish on Yom Kippurim, that it's not an inui, but it upends the whole shot of that pasuk. And how does Rav Papa know that inui and inui is tashmish? Dichtiv vayishkav ota vayanea, right? That he laid with her vayanea. So who is that talking about?
Shechem and Dinah.
That's Shechem and Dinah, right? So that with Shechem and Dinah, hold on a second. I think I have that pasuk. All right, let's get, it'll just take a second. Let's bring it up. It's not cooperating with me. There we go. Let me share this with you. ותצא דינה בת לאה אשר ילדה ליעקב לראות בבנות הארץ. וירא אותה שכם בן חמור אחיו נשיא הארץ, ויקח אותה, וישכב אותה, ויעניה. So Rav Papa is saying, look, we see from this pasuk that the Lashon of Inui means to have sexual relations. And therefore, all the things we said, therefore it's going to upend everything that the Gemara said until now. Sorry, 1 second. I have the back and forth thing. 1 second. What happened to it? Right. Amar Rav Papa Abaye, hatashmish gufa yikra inui, dichtiv vayishkav ota vayana. Amar lei, so by Sister Rav Papa, hatam she'ina mibiot acherot. There, it's talking about making her suffer from other intercourses, from other sexual intercourses, from other biot. In other words, we'll see how Rashi understands it, but we understand that Abaye is saying to Rav Papa, Vayanea in that context also means to suffer. It also means to suffer. and it's that she suffers from other biot. Now, in the immediate context, what it should be is that he made her suffer from withholding other biot. In other words, if we want inui in this context to mean withholding sex, then what Abaye must be saying to Rav Papa is, there he actually made her suffer by withholding sex, and it still means what we've said it means all along, that inui means to withhold sex.
Shale,
Yes.
it doesn't make sense because no,
Go ahead.
because his father went to Yaakov and he asked him to that his son could marry the Dinah. So if he wants to marry her, that he obviously wouldn't withhold from her sex.
Oh, but we'll see. No, so we'll see now how Rashi explains this, and this is how we have to understand. Now, remember, when Abaye says this, what's our assumption until now? What's Rav Papa's assumption? Rav Papa's assumption is Vayishkav and Vayanea are really the same thing. In other words, Vayanea is just is like a further explication of Vayishkav. What Abaye is saying is that no, they were two completely separate things. That first Vayishkav ota, and then Vayanea. It wasn't the same thing. So what does it mean? Vayanea mibiot acherot. So Rashi explains, and this might sound quite fanciful, but it's an interesting way to understand the pasuk. Mibiot acherot. Rashi says, "Shaita mitavelo v'lo ba'a leha ba'onata b'yamim shamda etzlo." In other words, there's a whole story now that's being assumed in these three words, that Vayishkavota, then Naniach, that was, we might even consider that then as we like the pshat that we would have always considered, which is that he raped her. It doesn't say that he raped her. It says that he had sex with her. In other words, we understand Vayishkav, the lashon, sagi nahor of the Torah means that he had sex with her. But at that moment, we'll understand that that wasn't something that Dinah initiated. It was something that Shem initiated, because it's Vayishkav Ota. He did it to her. What's the Vayanea? There's an assumption that after she slept with him, she wanted more. She wanted to sleep with him continuously. And he withheld sex from her at that point. And that's what Rashi is saying. She had a desire for him, that is to sleep with him. He didn't have sex with her in her time. In other words, in this idea of ona that we see elsewhere, which is the time that a wife is entitled to have sex with her husband, so they're not married. He withheld sex from her. In other words, in this telling of the story, now this upends, not entirely, but it gives a whole different light to the story, which is that maybe then we'll understand that Shem, when he beds Dinah the first time, he couldn't help himself. But he really did want to marry her. He didn't see this as some kind of a fling that he was going to rape this woman and then discard her. He really wanted to marry her. And once he got it out of his system to have sex with her, then he wanted to behave properly. And he withheld sex from her until such time as they could be formally married. And in the meantime, Dinah, she wants to continue and have more sex. And it's Shem who's making her suffer by not having sex with her. Now,
That's a completely chauvinistic interpretation. I'm sorry.
Well, you know what? I think it's very hard to get around a certain chauvinistic, interpretation of the story altogether. But what I'll say, I mean, I could also argue that it's not necessarily so chauvinistic, that maybe it's a reflection of a true female desire. Although the reason that you could say this pshat at all is because Dina is silent, right? It's one of the issues that we learned when we learned that parsha. We don't know what Dina thinks about anything. We don't know how she feels about getting raped or having sex or marrying Shem or not marrying Shem or we don't know anything about her. So this pshat is, in a sense, it's as good as any other pshat. It's as reasonable as any other pshat, and it introduces, it's based on a certain psychological component, which, according to Abaye, in the way Abaye would tell it, he's in a sense forced to give this pshat because he understands vayana in the context of sex means withholding sex. Let's just finish this off. So that's Rashi's pshat. Then Rashi says, "Vani shamati," and I heard, "She'inami biot acherot, sheba aleh shelo kedarka." I heard another perush to this Gemara that what was Vayishkavota vayana, that he had sex with her, that would be having normal vaginal sex, and vayana would mean that he had anal sex, that he made her suffer from other intercourses. And what would be the other intercourses? Biyah shelo kedarka. Biyah shelo kedarka means having anal sex. And Rashi, the kashali. So this is a perush that Rashi heard, and he says, but this perush is difficult to me. Im kain ema im ta'aned benotai nami hachi ashpei. Because if that's true, if vayaneh means to have anal sex, then I have to go back to the earlier part of the sugya and say that must have been what Lavan was making Yaakov swear, that he wouldn't have biyah shelo kedarka with Rachel and Leah. Shelo ya'aneh otam mibiyot acherot. That must be what that Lavan made him swear. Va'od she'ina biviyot acherot mibayileh. And further, now Rashi's being medayek in the grammar of the Gemara. The Gemara says she'ina mi biyot acherot. Mi, the mem here, would signal with withholding, that he made her suffer from the withholding of other biyot. If it would be that he made her suffer from having unnatural intercourse, right, having biyah shelo kedarka, it should have said she'ina biviyot. He made her suffer by having with biyot acherot, with biyot shelo kedarka. All that to say, this is a good place to stop. The Gemara's conclusion is that I will learn out ultimately from Intanet Benotai that withholding sexual relations is called inui. It's called an inui. I think we'll leave it at that. Next week we're going to continue, and then the Gemara is going to start to go into specific cases about the inui, beginning with Rafitza. And yeah, that's it. Any last questions or comments? Paul, you look bemused. Like this is, right? No, look, it's a I don't know. It's a very interesting. Like this last thing, I do think it's very interesting.
I have to ask my wife. She's retired now, but she's a teacher, Bible teacher. Was she knows the text very well, and
So she might be familiar with this pshat from the Gemara.
okay.
You know,
no, probably she now she also takes Gemara for women. I don't know.
You could discuss it with her, and then you can also
Okay.
get a female point.
I don't know if they talked about that, but anyway, I asked.
Okay. All right. So everybody have a Shabbat Shalom, and see you next week.
Good night,
Okay.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Thank you. Bye.